Wed the Magistrate or get out, her guardian barked, and stood with the door of his cold house at his back and his hard mercenary face set against her, fully expecting that the threat of the night and the cold and the pitiless world would do, in an instant, what months of bullying had not, and bring his proud, penniless ward to heel. He had given Isobel Grey the choice as a man gives a choice he is certain of. Marry the magistrate he had picked out for her, a hard, cold widower twice her age, whose suit suited her guardian's purposes far better than her own, or be turned out of the only roof she had into the night with nothing. He had not the smallest doubt of her answer. An orphan of 20, with no money, no family but himself, and nowhere on earth to go, does not, in the ordinary way of things, choose the open road and the winter dark over a respectable establishment, however little she may relish the man attached to it. And Mr. Crouch, who reckoned every soul by its weakness and had never in his life met a person who valued anything above their own comfort and safety, was as sure of bending his ward to his will as he was of anything. He had reckoned, as such men always do, without the one thing he could not see, that his quiet, dignified ward had a worth he had never troubled to measure, and a will beneath her patience that would sooner walk into the cold and the dark and the ruin of the world than be sold to a man she could not respect. She got out. She did not argue, for she had learned long ago that argument was wasted on him. She did not weep, for she would not give him the satisfaction. She simply looked at him for one long, steady moment, and then she turned and took up the small bundle she had already. In her heart, prepared, and walked past him and out of his cold house into the freezing fog of the November night, choosing the friendless dark over the sale of herself, her dignity over her safety, the unknown over the unbearable. The door shut behind her with a sound like the closing of a book, and Isobel Grey stood alone on the road in the swirling fog, with no money and no shelter and no notion in the world of where she would lay her head that night, having thrown away the only security she had sooner than be bought, and she did not know, how could she have known, that the cold, blind fog ahead of her was not empty, for there was a figure waiting in it. The Duke of Greywood was waiting in the fog, and the cold dark into which her courage had driven her was about to prove the road, by the strangest of all providences, to the one true home she had ever had. To understand how a penniless girl came to walk into a freezing fog sooner than be sold, and where she had found the courage to do it, you must first understand who Isobel Grey was and the long, hard schooling in being unwanted that had, paradoxically, taught her exactly what she was worth. She was the orphaned daughter of a country clergyman of small means and large heart, a gentle, scholarly man who had died when she was 15, her mother having died some years before, and she had been left, as such daughters so often are, with a good name, a well-stocked mind, a heart taught to value the right things, and not a penny in the world. With no near family but her mother's brother, she had been taken in by him, by Mr. Crouch, a hard, grasping, mercenary country gentleman who received his orphan niece less from affection than from a grudging sense of what the world would say if he did not, and who made her understand, from the first day, the precise and narrow terms of her dependence, that she was a charge upon his charity, an expense he resented, a poor relation who must earn her bread by usefulness and gratitude, and a becoming sense of her own insignificance. She had lived under his roof for 5 years, useful and unthanked, doing the work of an unpaid servant and bearing the slights of an unwanted dependent, watched over not from love but from calculation, valued not for herself but for what use might one day be made of her. And through those 5 years Isobel Grey had learned the lesson that such a life teaches the strong and breaks the weak upon, how to keep her own soul whole and her own sense of her own worth entire, under the steady grinding pressure of being treated as a thing of no account. She had no money, no protector, no power, nothing the world reckoned worth having. But she had her father's teaching deep in her, that a person's worth is not in their purse or their prospects, but in their character, their honesty, their courage, the quality of their soul, and she held to that teaching stubbornly, through every humiliation, drawing from it a quiet, unbreakable dignity that her grasping uncle mistook for meekness, and that was in truth its very opposite. She had borne much, and would have borne more. She was no rebel, and asked only to be let live in peace. But there was a line in her, drawn deep by her father's hand, that she would not cross whatever it cost her. She would not sell herself. She would not give her hand where she could not give her respect. She would not, to buy her own safety, do the one thing that would make her despise herself forever. And when her uncle, reckoning her at nothing, ordered her across that line, she discovered, and so in time did he, that the meek dependent he thought he had broken had a courage in her that no threat could reach, and a worth that was about to carry her, by way of a freezing fog, further than her grasping uncle had ever dreamed of rising. The courage that let Isobel walk into a freezing fog sooner than be sold was not born on that road, but laid down, year by year, in a poor, warm parsonage by a father who valued the right things. Her early years had been poor in money and rich in everything else. Her father, the Reverend Mr. Grey, had been a gentle, scholarly, deeply good man, a country clergyman of small living and large heart, who had loved his motherless daughter dearly and raised her, after his fashion, to value the things that cannot be bought. There had never been much money in that quiet parsonage, but there had been books and good talk and kindness, and the daily example of a man who held his integrity and his conscience dearer than any comfort or advancement. And Isobel had grown up secure in the one wealth that lasts, the knowledge that she was loved, and the deeper knowledge, instilled in her by her father's every word and act, that the worth of a person lies not in their fortune or their station, but in their honesty, their courage, and the quality of their soul. It was a foundation laid deep, and it would bear in the hard years to come a great weight of trouble without cracking. Her father had told her again and again in the gentle, earnest way that fixes a thing in a child's heart forever, that she must never sell her honor for her safety, never give her hand or her word where she could not give her respect. Never let the world persuade her that a poor person is a lesser person, or that security is worth the price of self-betrayal. She had not understood, as a child, how hard those teachings would one day be to keep, but she had taken them in, and they had become the bedrock of her character, the deep place from which, when the test came, her courage rose. When her father died and she passed into her grasping uncle's cold house, she carried that bedrock with her, and through 5 years of being treated as a thing of no account, it was that buried certainty of her own worth, planted by a loving father in a poor, warm home, that kept her from believing the low valuation the world pressed on her. And that would, in the end, send her out into the fog with her head high rather than betray the things her father had taught her to hold dear. The world reckoned her a penniless nobody. Her father had taught her she was a person of worth, and she had believed him, and it made all the difference. Those 5 years under her uncle's roof were the cold school in which Isobel's dignity was tested, and they show what manner of man could order his own niece to marry where she could not respect, or be cast into the dark. Mr. Crouch was not, perhaps, a wicked man by the measure he would have applied to himself. He was merely a hard, grasping, entirely worldly one, who reckoned every person and everything by its use and its cost to him, and who had no place in his philosophy for affection, generosity, or the worth of a soul. When his sister died and left a penniless orphan with no nearer relation, he had taken the child in, but he had taken her in as a man assumes a disagreeable duty, grudging every expense she cost him and reminding her, by 100 small daily economies and coldnesses, that she was a charge upon his charity and had better make herself useful and grateful in proportion. He had set her to the work of an unpaid servant, companion and housekeeper and seamstress and drudge by turns, had begrudged her every comfort, had never in 5 years spoken to her a word of warmth or treated her as anything but a liability to be managed and, if possible, profitably discharged. And Isobel had borne it, for she had no choice, and because her father had taught her to do her duty wherever she was placed, and to keep her own soul whole whatever was done to it. She had worked hard and uncomplainingly, had given her uncle no just cause for displeasure, had kept her dignity intact through every slight by the simple refusal to believe his low valuation of her. But she had no illusions about him, and no affection from him to soften her clear sight. She knew herself unwanted, knew that her uncle's interest in her was purely calculating, knew that the day would come when he would find some way to turn her to profit or be rid of her. What she had not quite foreseen was how brutal the discharge would be when it came, that he would try to sell her, plainly and coldly, to the highest and most convenient bidder, and would cast her into the dark when she refused. But when it came, she found she was ready for it. For 5 years in Mr. Crouch's cold house had taught her exactly what such men valued and exactly what they could not touch, and had tempered the dignity her father had given her into something hard and bright and unbreakable. He had spent 5 years teaching her, without meaning to, that she could expect nothing from him but use. She had learned the lesson well, and when he ordered her to be sold, she knew, with a clear and steady certainty, that she owed him no obedience that would cost her her soul. The Duke himself must be understood next, and the cold creed by which he had ordered his life. And the strange, unbidden feeling that had drawn him, of all places, to a foggy country road on the very night his ward chose the dark, for he was no romantic hero by his own reckoning, but a man who had taught himself, on principle, to do without his heart. Conrad, Duke of Greywood, was 37, and he was, by long discipline, the most self-commanded man in England. He had come young to a great and a demanding inheritance, and had met it as he met everything, with a cold and a relentless self-mastery, had made of himself, by sheer force of will, exactly the man he believed his position required, controlled, reserved, dutiful, governed in all things by reason and never by feeling. And somewhere in the making of that self-command he had arrived at a settled conviction that ruled his whole life, that strong feeling was a weakness, that love in particular was a folly fit only for lesser men, and that he himself was constituted, by temperament and by training both, to live without it. He did not believe himself capable of love, and did not wish to be. He had watched the passions of other men make fools and slaves of them, and had resolved to be neither, he intended, when duty at last obliged him to marry, to choose a wife by reason as he chose everything, and to give her his name and his protection and his cold, correct respect, and never one particle of a heart he was convinced he did not possess. He was not cruel, the Duke of Greywood. He was not even cold exactly, beneath the surface. He was something rarer and, in its way, sadder, a warm-natured man who had so thoroughly disciplined himself out of feeling that he had come to believe the feeling was not there. How such a man came to be on a foggy country road at night, near the house of a grasping gentleman and his unwanted ward, is a question he could not afterward fully answer himself. He had met Isobel Grey some weeks before, by chance at a neighbor's house where business had brought him, had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with the quiet, dignified girl whom everyone else ignored, and had found, to his own faint disturbance, that he could not afterward put her out of his mind. There had been something in her, a quality, a depth, a steady self-possession shining out of a hard and graceless situation, that had struck him as he was not used to being struck, and that had troubled the cold order of his thoughts in a way he did not understand and did not welcome. He had learned, in the way one learns such things in the country, of her circumstances, and of the match her guardian meant to force upon her, had told himself sternly that it was no concern of his, and had found, none the less, that the thought of it would not let him rest. And so, on the night the matter was to be decided, The most self-governed man in England had done a thing entirely against his own cold principles. He had come, with no clear purpose he would admit to be near, had let the fog and a lamed horse, and a dozen reasons that were not the real reason, bring him to that road, and was waiting there, in the cold and the dark, not knowing himself what he waited for. When the door of the cold house opened, and a girl walked out of it into the fog, having chosen, as he could scarcely believe, the cold dark sooner than the sale of herself, he had taught himself that he had no heart. He was about to discover, on a foggy road on a November night, exactly how wrong he had been. Behind all the Duke's coldness lay a wound, if wound it can be called. Stranger and sadder than the ordinary hardness of a hard man, the particular discipline by which he had mastered himself out of feeling. He had not been born cold. As a boy, those who remembered him said, the present Duke of Greywood had been warm, affectionate, and quick to feeling, but he had come young to his great inheritance, on the early death of his father, and had been handed, at an age when most boys are still at their games, a weight of responsibility and consequence that would have crushed a weaker nature. He had not let it crush him, he had risen to it, with a strength of will remarkable in one so young, but he had risen to it by a particular and a costly method. He had concluded, watching the world and his own untried heart. That feeling was a danger to a man in his position, that to be governed by emotion was to be weak, and to be weak was to fail in his great trust, and he had set himself, deliberately and relentlessly, to master his own nature, to subdue his warm impulses, to govern himself by cold reason alone, and he had succeeded, as such strong, determined natures do, only too well. Year by year he had disciplined the warmth out of himself, until the discipline became second nature, and the second nature came at last to seem the only nature he had. He had practiced the suppression of feeling so long and so thoroughly that he had ceased to feel, or believed he had buried his own heart so deep beneath the cold structures of his self-command that he had forgotten it was there, and had come to think of himself, with a kind of grim pride, as a man simply constituted without the softer passions, a creature of reason and duty and will. He did not know that the warmth was not gone, but only buried, that the heart he thought he had done without was alive beneath the frost, waiting, that all his cold self-command was not the absence of feeling, but the long, forcible denial of it. It is a commoner thing than the world supposes, this burying of a living heart under the weight of duty and discipline, and a sadder, for the man who does it loses, without knowing he has lost it, the best part of his own nature, and lives a gray and a guarded life in the cold belief that he was made for nothing better. Such a man was the Duke of Greywood, not heartless, but heart-buried, not cold by nature, but cold by long and costly art, and waiting, though he would have laughed to be told it, for the one thing that could break the frost and call the buried heart back to the light. He found it, all unlooked for, in a friendless girl in a fog. But that is to run ahead of the tale. Long before the foggy night, at a single brief meeting, Isobel had pierced the armor of a man-proof against the whole flattering world, and that small seed, weeks in the dark, was where everything grew from. It had happened at the house of a country neighbor, where business had brought the Duke, and where Isobel had been present, as she was sometimes obliged to be, in attendance on her uncle. The Duke had noticed her, at first, only as one notices a quiet figure at the edge of a room. She was not beautiful in the way that draws the eye, nor placed so as to be remarked, but stood among the company in the half-invisible position of the poor dependent, ignored by nearly everyone. But something had drawn his attention to her and then held it. He had watched her, in the course of that visit, bear a piece of casual unkindness from her uncle with a dignity that did not flinch, had seen her show a quiet kindness to a servant that no one else in the room troubled to show, had caught once the grave intelligent light of her eye as some folly was talked near her, and read in it a mind and a judgment far above the chattering company that ignored her. And he had found to his own faint disturbance that he could not look away. The Duke of Greywood had spent his life among people who performed for him, flattered him, angled for his notice, and here was a young woman who did none of these things, who did not know or care that he was watching, who simply was, quietly and with an unconscious dignity, a person of real and evident worth in a room full of people of none. It struck him as he was not used to being struck. He exchanged a few words with her before he left, ordinary words about nothing in particular, and found her answers as quietly remarkable as the rest of her, and he carried away from that brief meeting an impression that would not fade, the image of a young woman shining with an unregarded worth in a careless room that returned to him at odd moments in the weeks that followed and troubled the cold order of his thoughts more than he could account for or liked. He told himself it signified nothing. A man might be struck by a fine quality in a stranger and think no more of it. But the impression would not be dismissed. It worked in him quietly, beneath his notice, and when, weeks later, he heard of the cruel match her guardian meant to force upon her, it was that buried impression, that unfading image of her unregarded worth, that would not let him rest, and that drew him at last, against all his cold principles, to a foggy road on a fateful night. The man Isobel fled into the fog to escape was as cold and joyless a prospect as ever a young woman was ordered to embrace, and the sight of the magistrate explains much of her courage. Mr. Birch was the local magistrate, a man of consequence in the small world of the parish, and a hard, cold, self-righteous creature in every particular of his nature. He was past 50, a widower of some years who had worn out one wife in joyless service and was now in the market for another, and he administered both his household and the law of the district with the same stony, pitiless severity, a man who took a grim satisfaction in punishment, who reckoned mercy a weakness and warmth a folly, and whose cold gray eye had never, in all his years, rested kindly upon any living thing. He was respectable, and respected after a fashion, and feared a good deal, but he was loved by no one, and deserved to be, and the prospect of being bound for life to such a man, of keeping his comfortless house, and tending his comfortless person, and bearing his cold displeasure to the end of her days, was one that any woman of feeling might have shrunk from, and that Isobel, with her warm heart and her father's teaching, found simply unendurable. It was not merely that Mr. Birch was old, or hard, or unlovable, though he was all three. It was that to marry him would have been, for Isobel, a betrayal of everything she held dear. She could have borne poverty and labor and the cold charity of her uncle's house. She had borne all of those. But to give her hand, her body, her whole life into the keeping of a man she could not respect and did not love, to vow before God to honor where she felt only distaste, to sell herself for the price of a roof and a respectable name to a cold, cruel stranger twice her age, that was the one thing she could not do, the one line her father's teaching and her own soul forbade her to cross. The magistrate himself never understood her refusal. He had offered, as he saw it, a more than respectable settlement to a penniless nobody who ought to have jumped at it, and her rejection struck him as mere ingratitude and folly. He never grasped, being incapable of grasping it, that the friendless girl he had thought to acquire so cheaply held her own worth at a price he could not pay, and would walk into the winter dark with nothing sooner than be his. It was the first lesson the cold magistrate received in the worth of the woman he had reckoned at nothing. It would not be the last. If you were listening by your own fire tonight, the lamp turned low, the dark drawn gentle and close, the night shut safely out beyond the glass, then settle yourself, and let me tell you how a girl who walked into a freezing fog sooner than be sold found, waiting in it, the one man who would teach her she was beyond all price. And how a man who believed he had no heart discovered, on a foggy road, that he had given it away entire. For this is a story about worth that will not be bought, and a courage that chose the cold dark over a comfortable cage, about a man so master of himself that he had mastered his own heart out of existence until a friendless girl in the fog called it back to life, and about the strange providence by which the road we take in despair sometimes leads us straight to the thing we had given up hoping for. I shall tell you before the end where in the world I picture you sitting, by what far fire. But first you must hear how the ultimatum came to be spoken, and what manner of bargain it was that Isobel Grey walked into the dark sooner than make. It was no ordinary marriage that Isobel was ordered to make, but a cold transaction designed wholly for her guardian's advantage, in which she figured not as a bride, but as a piece of goods to be disposed of. The man chosen for her was Mr. Birch, the local magistrate, a hard, cold, self-important widower of more than twice Isobel's years, a man of consequence in the small world of the parish, feared rather than loved, who administered the law with a stony severity and his household with the same. He had taken it into his head that he wanted a young wife, a biddable one, to keep his comfortless house and tend his comfortless person, and he had cast his eye upon Mr. Crouch's penniless ward as exactly the sort of dependent creature who could be had cheap and would not dare to refuse. And Mr. Crouch, for his part, had embraced the match with a grasping enthusiasm, for it served his every interest at a stroke. It would rid him of the expense and the encumbrance of a niece he had never wanted. It would bind him in useful connection to the magistrate, whose favor and whose local power Mr. Crouch had reasons of his own for desiring. And it would settle, cheaply and conveniently, a charge upon his charity that he had grudged for 5 long years, that the bridegroom was hard, cold, and old enough to be the bride's father, that Isobel could feel for him nothing but a shrinking distaste, that the marriage promised her a lifetime of joyless servitude to an unloving and unlovable man. These were considerations that did not weigh with Mr. Crouch in the smallest degree, for he did not reckon his niece's happiness a thing of any value, and would have been honestly puzzled to be told he ought to. So the bargain was struck between the two men, over Isobel's head and without the smallest reference to her wishes, exactly as they might have struck a bargain over a horse, and Isobel was informed, not consulted, that she was to marry the magistrate, and that she had better be grateful for so respectable a settlement of a penniless girl. She had refused, quietly and steadily, again and again, through weeks of bullying and pressure, and her uncle, his patience and his temper alike exhausted, had come at last to the ultimatum with which this story opened, certain that the threat of destitution would break a resistance that all his other threats had failed to break. He had reckoned, as he always reckoned, on her fear, and he had left out of his reckoning, as he always left out, her worth. For Isobel Grey would have borne a great deal sooner than make a scene or cause a trouble, but she would not be sold, and when the choice was put to her bare and brutal at last, wed the magistrate or get out, she found that the answer her whole soul gave was not the one her uncle had counted on, and walked out of his house and into the fog to prove it. The hours of that foggy night, between the slamming of her uncle's door and her arrival at her godmother's house, were the strangest and most fateful of Isobel's life, and the courage she showed in them was of a quieter, harder kind than the courage of her refusal. It is one thing to refuse, in the heat of the moment, to be sold. It is another to stand alone on a dark road in a freezing fog, the door shut behind you, and face the full reality of what your refusal has cost you. Isobel faced it. In the first moments after the door closed, she stood quite still, the cold fog wrapping her round, and let herself understand, clearly and without flinching, exactly what she had done, that she had thrown away the only shelter she possessed, defied the only protector she had, and committed herself, a penniless girl, to the open road and the winter night, with no plan, no destination, and no notion of how she should live or where she should sleep. It was a moment that might have broken a weaker resolve, sent her creeping back to the door to beg her uncle's pardon and submit after all. It did not break Isobel's. She looked the ruin she had chosen full in the face and found that she did not repent it, that for all its terror she would rather be here, free and cold and friendless in the fog, than warm and safe and sold in her uncle's house. That she had, in the worst hour of her life, done the thing her father would have been proud of, and could live, even die, content in the knowledge of it. And it was in that moment of clear-eyed acceptance, when she had faced the worst and chosen it, that the figure appeared in the fog. There is something to be remarked in the timing of it, though Isobel was too shaken to remark it then, that the help came not before her courage was tested, but after, that she was not spared the full reckoning of her choice, but made to stand alone in the dark and own it utterly, before ever the rescue showed itself. She had to choose the fog with no one waiting in it, so far as she knew, had to stake everything on her own worth, and her own integrity with no assurance of any reward, had to be willing, truly willing, to walk into the friendless dark and pay the whole price of her refusal. And only then, when her courage had proved itself complete and unbought, did the dark prove not to be empty after all. It was as though some justice in the nature of things had waited to see whether she meant it, and finding that she did, had sent its help, as though the road taken in pure courage, with no hope of reward, were the very road most likely, in the end, to have someone waiting at its end. She did not understand that, on the dark road, with her whole life in ruins around her. She only knew that she had chosen rightly, though it cost her everything, and that incredibly she was not alone. What passed on the foggy road when the girl walked out of the dark house and found the silent figure waiting was the strangest meeting of both their lives, and the hinge on which both their fates would turn. She had walked perhaps 100 yards into the blind white fog, her small bundle in her hand, her heart steady but her mind a blank of pure uncertainty, with no notion of where she went save away, when she became aware of the shape ahead of her, a tall dark figure and the loom of a horse, and the dim warm glow of a carriage lamp burning amber in the cold gray murk. She stopped. In the ordinary way, a girl alone on a dark road at night has every reason to fear a stranger, but there was something in the still figure that did not frighten her, and besides, she was past fear, having staked everything already on her flight, and the figure came toward her, resolving out of the fog into a tall, dark, grave gentleman of unmistakable consequence, who stopped a courteous distance off, and removed his hat and addressed her, to her great astonishment, by name. It was the Duke of Greywood, whom she had met but once, weeks before, and exchanged a dozen words with, and never thought to see again, and he was there. On the road, in the fog, at the very hour of her flight, as though he had been waiting for her. He had been waiting for her, though he could scarcely have said so. He asked her, gravely and without the smallest impertinence, whether she was in trouble, and whether he might be of service, and Isobel, looking up into the grave, concerned face of the one person in all that cold country who had ever looked at her as though she mattered, found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she trusted him. She could not speak much. She was too near the edge of her composure for that, but she told him, in a few steady words, the bare truth, that she had been ordered to marry a man she could not respect, and had refused, and had been turned out, and had nowhere to go. And the Duke of Greywood, hearing it, felt rise in him a thing he had not felt in years, and did not at first recognize: a hot, protective, wholly unreasoning anger on her behalf, and beneath it a fierce determination that this brave, friendless girl should not, while he had breath, be left to the cold and the dark and the mercy of the world. He did not stop to examine the feeling. There would be time for that. And for his alarm at it, later, he did the thing the feeling demanded. He offered her, at once and with grave decision, his protection, his carriage, his honor, and the immediate shelter of respectable friends, promised her, on the word of a gentleman, that she should come to no harm and be subject to no impropriety, and conveyed her, that foggy night, out of the friendless dark and toward the first safety she had known in 5 long years. He had told himself, an hour before, that her plight was no concern of his. He had made it, in the space of a single foggy meeting, the chief concern of his life. The shelter to which the Duke brought her proved to be a homecoming Isobel had never dared to hope for among the respectable friends to whom he conveyed her was the one person living who had loved her mother and would love her, and whom her grasping uncle had kept from her for 5 long years. The Duke, casting about that foggy night for where a gentlewoman might be safely and respectably bestowed, had bethought himself of his own connections in the neighborhood, and among them of a formidable old lady of his acquaintance, the Dowager Countess of Marbury, who kept a great house not many miles off, and who was, the Duke knew, a woman of unimpeachable respectability and an unexpectedly warm heart beneath her grand manner. He had brought Isobel there, and it was in Lady Marbury's candlelit drawing-room, late that strange night, that the second great providence of the evening befell. For the Dowager Countess, hearing the girl's name, had started and looked at her hard, and demanded to know whose daughter she was, and learning that she was the child of a certain gentle clergyman and his wife, had risen and taken the astonished girl by both hands, and declared with tears in her shrewd old eyes that she was Isobel's own godmother, the dearest friend of Isobel's dead mother, who had stood sponsor to her at the font and had grieved for years over losing all trace of her. It was true. Lady Marbury had loved Isobel's mother as a sister in their girlhood, had wept at her death, and would gladly have taken the orphan child to raise. But Mr. Crouch, asserting his rights as the nearest blood relation and nursing some old grudge besides, had refused all her overtures, had cut off the correspondence, had kept the child from her godmother as he kept her from everything that might have warmed or befriended her, until Lady Marbury, rebuffed and at last losing the trail, had been forced to give up the search and had supposed her goddaughter lost to her for good. And now, by the strangest turn of a strange night, the lost child stood before her, grown and friendless and brave, brought out of the fog to her very door. There was weeping then, and the holding of hands, and the broken telling of long-divided stories, and Isobel Grey, who had walked into the freezing dark an hour before with no one in all the world to turn to, found herself, before that night was out, sheltered, claimed, and loved, restored to the godmother she had never known she had. In the warm candlelight of a house that wanted her, she had chosen the friendless dark sooner than be sold, and the dark, by a providence she could never have foreseen, had led her straight home. In the hours after he brought Isobel to safety, the Duke felt the first stirring of the buried heart, and it threw the most self-governed man in England into a confusion he had not known since boyhood. He had acted on the foggy road with perfect decision, had known exactly what to do and done it, conveyed the girl to safety with all the cool competence of his nature. But when it was done, when he had left her in Lady Marbury's warm and respectable keeping, and ridden home alone through the thinning fog, he found himself in a state of mind entirely foreign to him. He could not stop thinking of her. The image of her as he had found her on the road, brave and friendless and unbroken in the freezing dark, returned to him again and again, the few words she had spoken, the steady courage of her, the quality that had struck him weeks before and struck him tenfold now, filled his thoughts and would not be dismissed. He told himself it was a natural concern for an unfortunate fellow creature he had been able to assist, but the feeling was warmer and more particular than any such concern had a right to be, and it disturbed the cold order of his inner life as nothing had disturbed it in years. The Duke of Greywood had not felt anything so strongly in a very long time, and he had quite lost the habit of it. And the unfamiliar warmth, stirring in the buried places of his heart, alarmed him almost as much as it moved him. He examined it, in his cold analytical way, and could not name it. He had so thoroughly convinced himself that he was a creature without the softer feelings that he had no category for what he was feeling, and kept assigning it to honor, to duty, to a disinterested benevolence. when it was in plain truth the first warm flooding of a heart coming back to life. He resolved to put the girl out of his mind, and could not. He resolved to do his honorable part by her and trouble himself no further, and found himself instead lying awake devising how he might secure her future, how he might shield her from her uncle, how he might keep her, in short, from ever passing again out of the circle of his protection. He did not yet understand that he was falling in love. He had buried the very faculty too deep to recognize its stirring. But the buried heart had stirred, on a foggy road, at the sight of a brave, friendless girl, and once stirred, it would not be still again. The godmother who reclaimed Isobel and became her staunchest champion was a formidable old ally to have. The Dowager Countess of Marbury threw the whole weight of her consequence and her warm, shrewd heart into her goddaughter's cause. Lady Marbury was a great old lady of near 70, the widow of an earl, a personage of immense consequence in the county and beyond, with a grand manner, a sharp tongue, and a warm and loyal heart that her grandeur did not hide from those who knew her well. She had loved Isobel's mother dearly in their girlhood, the two of them having been the closest of friends before marriage and distance and the death of the one had parted them, and she had grieved bitterly at her friend's death, and would have taken the orphaned child to raise as her own, had not the grasping Mr. Crouch, asserting his rights and nursing some petty grudge, refused her every overture and at last cut off all communication, keeping the child from her godmother as he kept her from every warmth, until Lady Marbury, rebuffed and frustrated, and at length losing the very trail of the family, had been forced to give up and had carried for years the private grief of a goddaughter lost. And now the lost child was restored to her, brought out of a fog to her very door by the Duke of Greywood, and the Dowager Countess, having wept over her and claimed her and heard her whole sad story, set about the championship of her goddaughter with all the formidable energy of her nature. She took Isobel into her home and her heart. She stood by her through the strange, swift business of the Duke's offer and the marriage, and when, later, the slander of the balked guardian and magistrate threatened the girl's good name, it was Lady Marbury, who was her fiercest defender, who lent the whole weight of her ancient consequence to vouching for the bride's worth and quality, who declared to all the county that Isobel was the daughter of the dearest friend she had ever had, and a young woman of the first character, and who would have withered with a glance any person bold enough to whisper against her in her hearing. She was the great old ally that every wronged and friendless heroine needs, the one with the social weight and the loyal heart to make the world treat her goddaughter as she deserved. And she was, besides, a living link to the mother Isobel had lost, a warm presence out of her own happy childhood restored to her in her hour of need. The friendless girl who had walked into the fog with no one in all the world had come out of it with a godmother who loved her, and it was not the least of the providences of that strange night. It was the Duke who first spoke of marriage, and he spoke of it as he spoke of everything, with a cold and careful reasonableness that hid, even from himself, the true nature of what was moving him. Isobel's situation, even sheltered and reclaimed, was perilous, and the Duke's clear, hard mind saw it plainly. A young gentlewoman who has fled her guardian's house alone at night, however blameless her reasons, is fearfully exposed to the cruelty of the world's tongue. Her guardian, balked and vengeful, might pursue her, might spread some poisonous version of the tale, might even attempt to reclaim her or to press the magistrate's suit, her reputation, that fragile and precious possession of a friendless woman, hung by a thread that any malicious breath might snap. And the surest shield against all of it, the one thing that would place her beyond her guardian's reach and the world's slander alike, was a husband of consequence too great for any tongue to gainsay. The Duke saw the logic of it with perfect coldness, and acted on it. He came to Lady Marbury's house a few days after the foggy night, and offered Isobel his hand in marriage. But he offered it in a manner all his own, and the manner is the key to the man. He did not speak of love, he would have thought it dishonest, for he did not believe he felt it, nor capable of feeling it. He laid the matter before her, instead, as a thing of reason and honor, that her situation was dangerous, that his name and protection would shield her wholly, that he offered her, in plain terms, the security and consequence of his rank, a home, a refuge, an unassailable position, and his lifelong respect and good faith. He told her, with a scrupulous and rather chilling honesty, that she must not look to him for the warmth and the romance that other husbands might offer, for he was not made that way, and would not deceive her with a pretense of feelings he did not have. That he offered her a marriage of protection and esteem, an honorable bargain fairly stated, and no more. It was the coldest of proposals, and yet there was in it, had she known how to read it, something the Duke himself did not suspect, for a man who felt nothing would not have come, would not have troubled, would not have offered the whole shelter of his great name to a girl he had met but twice. He thought he was being merely just and honorable. He was, in truth, already half in love, and only the long habit of denying his own heart kept him from knowing it. He had taught himself so thoroughly that he could not feel, that he could not recognize the feeling even as it moved him to lay a dukedom at a penniless girl's feet. Isobel accepted him, but on terms of her own, and with a clear-eyed dignity that matched his cold honesty with an honesty of her own, for she would no more pretend to feelings she did not have than he would, and she would not enter even so honorable a bargain on any footing but the truth. She had heard him out, in Lady Marbury's drawing-room, with the grave composure that never deserted her, and she had understood his offer exactly for what it was, and weighed it exactly as it deserved. She was not in love with him. How could she be, on the strength of 2 meetings, however much his conduct in the fog had moved her? But she was not blind to what he offered, nor to the honor and the kindness that lay, however coldly stated, beneath the offer. She knew her situation. She knew that without some such shelter she stood in real danger. She knew that the man before her, for all his chilling talk of reason and esteem, had ridden into a fog to rescue a girl who was nothing to him, and had offered her the whole protection of his name, asking nothing in return, and that such a man, whatever he chose to call himself, was neither cold nor unkind at the core. And so she accepted him, but she did it on her own terms, plainly stated, that he might be in no more doubt of her than she was of him. She told him, having no voice for soft speeches and no wish to make them, that she accepted his offer and was grateful for it, that she would be to him a true and honorable wife, would order his house and grace his name and give him her loyalty and her good faith for as long as they both should live, but that she, too, would deal in truth and not in pretense, and would no more feign a love she did not yet feel than he would feign one he believed himself incapable of. She would give him, she said, exactly what he offered her: honor, esteem, fidelity, and the honest friendship of 2 people fairly joined, and she would ask of him exactly what he asked of her, no more and no less, and would never reproach him for the warmth he had warned her not to expect. It was as clear-eyed and as dignified a bargain as was ever struck between 2 proud, honest people, and there was a kind of splendid irony in it, though neither saw it then. For 2 people had just agreed, each in perfect good faith, to a marriage without love, each warning the other not to hope for a heart, and each of them was already, though neither would have believed it, further down the road to loving the other than either had ever been to loving anyone in all their lives. There was a rare dignity in the quiet wedding, and in the strange honorable footing on which the 2 of them began their married life, and a deeper feeling beneath the cold form than either of them yet allowed. They were married quietly, without display, a few weeks after the foggy night, from Lady Marbury's house, with the old Countess standing by her goddaughter in place of the family that had cast her off. It was, by the express agreement of both parties, a marriage of honor rather than of love, and yet there was nothing mean or cold in the manner of it, for 2 such people could not do even a cold thing meanly. The Duke treated his bride throughout with a grave courtesy that was, had she known how to read it, something warmer than courtesy, and Isobel met him with a quiet dignity that was, had he known how to read it, something warmer than mere acceptance. They had each been scrupulously honest with the other. Each had warned the other not to look for love, and each, beneath the honest, cold form, was already feeling more than the form allowed and hiding it, out of a punctilious unwillingness to claim more than had been promised. And so their married life began on a footing that the world would have thought bleak, and that was in truth, beneath its careful coolness. Charged with a feeling neither would confess, they were courteous, they were considerate, they observed with a delicacy that did them both credit the terms of the bargain they had struck, neither pressing the other for a warmth that had not been promised. But the courtesy kept warming, by imperceptible degrees, into something else. The Duke found small ways to please his wife that went beyond what mere honor required. Isobel found her husband's grave attentions touching her more than a marriage of convenience had any right to touch her. They were two proud, honest, guarded people, each determined not to claim more than was offered, each feeling more than they dared to show. And the cold, honorable marriage they had both braced themselves to endure was, from its very first days, quietly and against both their expectations, beginning to become something neither had bargained for and neither yet dared to name. The form was a marriage of convenience. The substance, growing daily beneath the form, was the beginning of a great love, and only the scrupulous honesty of two people who would not claim an unpromised heart kept either of them from seeing how far, already, they had both been carried. The turn came slowly, in the quiet weeks of their strange, honorable marriage, as the Duke discovered, against everything he believed about himself, that the heart he had disciplined out of existence was not dead after all, but had only been waiting, all his cold self-commanded life, for someone worth waking for. They were married quietly, and began their life together as their bargain promised, courteous, honorable, undemanding, two proud people sharing a great house and a great name on terms of mutual respect and no warmth professed. But a strange thing began to happen, so gradually that the Duke did not at first perceive it. He found himself seeking his wife's company. He told himself it was natural, that they were thrown together, that a man must converse with his wife. But it went beyond what mere civility required. He found the hours in her company the best of his days, found the great house, which had always suited his cold, solitary temper, well enough. Suddenly empty when she was not in it, found himself thinking of things to tell her, saving up the small events of his day to share with her, watching for her quiet smile and the grave light of her intelligence with a pleasure he could not account for on any principle of reason. He, who had ordered his whole life by reason, found his reason curiously silent on the subject of why his self-commanded heart had begun to beat faster at the sound of his wife's step in the hall. And piece by piece, against all his settled conviction, the truth forced itself upon him. He had believed himself incapable of love, and here, growing in him daily and past all his power to stop it, was love, unmistakable and overwhelming, for the brave, honest, dignified woman he had married for reasons of cold honor. He had told her he had no heart to give, and he discovered, with an astonishment that shook the foundations of his whole self-understanding, that he had given it to her entire, somewhere on a foggy road or in a candle-lit drawing-room, without ever knowing he was doing it. The discovery frightened him, as well it might, for it overturned the cold creed of his whole adult life, exposed the long self-command he had been so proud of as a mere denial of his own nature, and left him defenseless before a feeling he had spent years convincing himself he could not have. But it was too late to fight it. The heart he had disciplined out of existence had come roaring back to life, and would not be disciplined again. The most self-commanded man in England had fallen, helplessly and completely, in love with his own wife, and the only question that remained, gnawing at him through the long days, was whether the woman who had married him on the express understanding that he had no heart to give could ever be brought to want the heart that all unlooked for was now wholly and forever hers. A man does not surrender a creed of 20 years' standing without a struggle, and the way the Duke fought his own dawning love, even as it grew, was the truest drama of those quiet weeks. The love frightened him, the more it grew. He had built his whole adult self upon the conviction that he was a creature of reason, governed by will and not by feeling, immune to the passions that mastered weaker men. That conviction had been his pride and his identity, the very foundation of how he understood himself. And now that foundation was cracking beneath him. He, the master of his own heart, found his heart slipping its mastery. He, who had prided himself on feeling nothing, found himself feeling everything. And for a penniless girl he had married out of cold honor, it was intolerable to his pride and alarming to his whole sense of who he was, and so he fought it, with all the formidable discipline that had subdued his nature once before. He tried to reason the feeling away, to name it something less dangerous, to reassert the cold command that had ruled him so long. But the discipline that had buried his heart once could not bury it twice, for the heart was awake now and would not go back into the ground. Every effort he made to suppress the feeling only proved how strong it had grown. Every cold reason he marshaled against it was answered by the simple, overwhelming fact of how he felt when his wife entered a room. He would resolve in his study to treat her henceforth with a careful, distant courtesy, and find the resolve dissolve the moment he saw her. He would tell himself that what he felt was mere esteem, mere honorable attachment, and know, even as he told himself, that it was a great deal more. The most self-commanded man in England was discovering, to his alarm and against his will, that there was one thing his iron self-command could not master, and that was a true love once it had taken root, and the discovery was humbling him, breaking down the cold, proud edifice of his self-sufficiency, forcing him to admit that he was, after all, not the bloodless creature of reason he had believed himself, but a man like other men, with a heart like other men, and that heart now wholly and helplessly given. He had been so proud of his self-command. He was learning painfully and wonderfully that there are things a wise man does not command but surrenders to, and that the surrender of his cold heart to a brave girl's worth was not the defeat his pride had feared, but the beginning of his real life. In the small daily life of their marriage, in the weeks before the slander broke, two guarded people fell, without ever confessing it, deeper and deeper in love amid the ordinary shared hours of a great quiet house. They fell into habits, as married people do, but their habits had a particular sweetness, for they were the habits of two solitary souls discovering, each for the first time, the simple pleasures of true companionship. They took to breakfasting together, and then to lingering over it, took to walking the great grounds in the afternoons, the grave Duke and his quiet wife, talking of books and the estate and 100 things, their conversations growing longer and easier by the week. They spent their evenings together in the library or by the fire, he with his papers, she with her book, in a companionable quiet that came to be the best part of both their days. And in all these ordinary shared hours, 1,000 small unspoken tendernesses grew up between them. The way he learned the books she loved and saw that they were there for her, the way she learned the cares that weighed on him and lightened them by her quiet presence, the way each came to watch for the other, to save up things to share, to feel the day incomplete until they had met in it. Neither spoke of love, the terms of their bargain forbade it, and the pride of each kept silent what the bargain forbade. But love does not need to be spoken to be present, and it was present in every hour they spent together, growing in the warm silence between them like a plant in good soil. Anyone watching them, in those quiet weeks, would have seen what they could not see in themselves, two people falling deeper in love by the day, betrayed by 100 small signs, the lingering looks and the easy silences and the quiet pleasure each so plainly took in the other's company. Lady Marbury, visiting, saw it at once, and was hard put to it not to laugh at the spectacle of two such proud, honest creatures so plainly in love and so determinedly not admitting it. But the Duke and Isobel, each guarding a secret love and each certain it was not returned, saw only their own feeling and not the other's, and so they lived, in those weeks. In the strange, sweet, painful state of two people deeply in love and each believing themselves alone in it, building daily a happiness they did not dare to recognize until the slander came to force the truth, at last, into the open. Isobel's own heart had been changing, too, through those same quiet weeks, but her growing love brought her not joy but a deepening fear. For she believed she had married a man who could never love her back, and the belief became, as her own feeling grew, a quiet agony. She had come to love him, and it had crept upon her as such things do, gratitude first, for the rescue and the shelter and the honor, then respect, for the just and upright and secretly kind man she came to know beneath the cold reserve. Then, slowly and against her will, a deep and tender love for the husband who was so much more than the cold creature he believed himself to be. She saw past his self-command to the warm nature it denied, saw the man who had ridden into a fog for a stranger, who treated the humblest servant with grave justice, who was gentle with her in 100 small, unspoken ways his cold creed would never have permitted him to call gentleness. And she loved him for the man he truly was, the more tenderly for seeing how little he knew it himself. But the more she loved him, the more her own situation grieved her, for she remembered, always, the express terms of their bargain. He had told her plainly that he had no heart to give, that she must not look to him for love, that he was not made that way. He had been scrupulously honest, she could not reproach him, she had agreed to it with open eyes. But she had not known, agreeing, that she would come to love him, and now that she did, the cold terms she had accepted so calmly had become a daily wound. She bore it, of course, with her unfailing dignity, and let none of it show, for she would not break their bargain by burdening him with a love he had warned her not to feel, nor shame herself by begging for a regard he had told her he could not give. She kept her growing love locked away where he should never see it, and gave him only the honorable friendship she had promised, and suffered in a silence he never suspected. But it was a hard suffering, for there is no loneliness quite like the loneliness of loving, with one's whole heart, a person one lives beside and may not love aloud, of sharing a man's house and his name and his daily company while believing oneself shut out forever from his heart, of watching for some sign of a warmth one has been told will never come, and finding in his careful reserve only the confirmation of one's fear. She had married him believing he could not love her, and as her own love grew, that belief, which she had accepted so coolly as part of an honest bargain, became the central sorrow of her life, and prepared her, all unknowing, for the misunderstanding that was so nearly to part them. Isobel's secret suffering, as her love grew against the cold terms of her marriage, was a peculiar and a cruel kind of loneliness, and it explains why the slander, when it came, found her so ready to give him up. Consider her situation. She had married a man on the express and honest understanding that he could not love her. She had agreed to it with open eyes, asking nothing of his heart, and then, against all her intention, she had fallen in love with him, deeply and wholly, and found herself bound, by the very honesty of their bargain, to hide it. For she had given her word to ask nothing of him beyond what he had offered. She had her pride, which would not let her beg for a regard she had been told she could not have, and she had, above all, a delicacy that would not burden the husband who had been so good to her with the embarrassment of a love he had warned her not to feel and could not return. And so she carried her love in secret, day after day, living beside the man she adored and forbidden by honor and pride alike to let him see it, sharing his house, his name, his daily company, his very fireside, and believing herself shut out forever from the one thing she now wanted more than life, which was his heart. It was a loneliness crueler, in its way, than the loneliness of her uncle's house had been, for there she had at least had no reason to hope, and here she had every reason to hope and was forbidden to. She watched her husband for some sign that he might, after all, be coming to care for her and read his every kindness with a desperate attention, but his careful reserve, the very reserve that hid his own growing love, told her only that he felt nothing, that he was being merely good to her as he had promised, that the warmth she longed for was not there and never would be. Every courtesy he showed her, meant by him as the overflow of a love he dared not speak, was read by her as the mere discharge of an honorable duty, every reserve. Meant by him to hide a feeling he thought unwelcome, confirmed to her that the feeling did not exist. They were each, in their guarded honesty, sending the other exactly the wrong signal, and reading in the other's guardedness the death of the very hope that, could they but have seen it, was alive and growing in them both. And so Isobel suffered, in silence and in secret, the particular anguish of loving where she believed she could never be loved in return, and when the slander came to whisper that she was a burden and a regret to her husband, it found in her a heart already half persuaded of the very thing, and pushed her, with cruel ease, toward the renunciation that would so nearly have parted two people made for each other. The crisis came when the guardian and the magistrate, balked of their prey and stung by the spectacle of the penniless ward they had tried to sell rising to be a duchess, struck back with the only weapon left them, which was slander, and the slander, striking at the very fear that already tormented her, brought Isobel to the edge of giving up everything she had won. Mr. Crouch and Mr. Birch had not taken their defeat quietly. To have lost the biddable bride they had bargained over, to see her not merely escaped but exalted, married to a duke, raised to a height from which she might one day look down on the very men who had tried to dispose of her, it was gall to them both, and they set about, in the mean way of mean men, to poison the triumph they could not prevent. They put about, in the neighborhood and beyond, a poisonous version of the tale that the Duke's new duchess was no wronged innocent, but a scheming, ungrateful baggage, that she had thrown herself into a great man's path by a calculated flight, that she had entrapped the Duke of Greywood by playing on his chivalry, trapped him into a marriage far above her station by a piece of designing theater on a foggy road. It was a lie, and a transparent one, but slander needs no truth to wound, and this slander was cunningly aimed, for it suggested that the Duke had been not a rescuer, but a dupe, and that his marriage was a thing he might, on reflection, regret, and it was this last poison that found, in Isobel, a wound already open to receive it, for she heard the slander, as one always hears such things, and it struck directly at the fear she already carried, the fear that she was a burden her husband had taken on from honor and not from love. If the world believed he had been entrapped, might he not, in his secret heart, half believe it too? Had she not, however blamelessly, been the cause of his marrying beneath him, of his binding himself for life to a penniless nobody he did not love? Was she not, for all his courtesy, exactly what the slander said, a weight upon him, a regret, a duty he was too honorable to repudiate, but might, in his heart, wish undone? The cold terms of their bargain, which had told her plainly that he did not love her, now combined with the world's cruel whisper to form a single, unbearable conviction, that she had trapped a good man into a loveless marriage that did him nothing but harm, and that the one honorable thing left for her to do was to set him free. And so Isobel, in the depth of her misguided love, began to contemplate the hardest act of her life, to offer the husband she had come to adore his liberty, and to take herself, once more, out of a life she believed she only burdened. Through those same weeks of the slander, the Duke, too, was suffering in secret, and the spectacle of two people each breaking their heart for the other in the same silent house is one of the small tragedies that great loves so often pass through on their way to joy. The Duke had heard the slander too, and it had wounded him in a way the slanderers never intended. Not because he gave it the smallest credit, for he knew the truth of his own marriage better than anyone, but because he feared what it might do to his wife. He had come, by now, to love her past all his power of denial, and a man who loves dreads above all things the wounding of the beloved. He saw the slander going about, and he set himself coldly to crush it, but he feared, with a lover's anxious tenderness, that it might reach her, might trouble her, might waken her some doubt of her own welcome, and he watched her, in those weeks, with an anxious secret attention, longing to reassure her and forbidden, by the very terms of their bargain, to do it. For there lay his own private torment. He loved her wholly now, and longed to tell her so, but he had married her on the express understanding that he had no heart to give, had warned her himself not to look for love, and could not now in honor come to her and overturn the whole footing of their marriage with a declaration she had been promised would never come, and that he had no reason to think she would welcome. What if she did not return his feeling? She had married him for shelter, not for love, had accepted him on cold, honest terms, asking nothing of his heart. Might she not be embarrassed, even distressed, by a husband who broke the comfortable bargain by pressing upon her a love she had not bargained for and might not want? He, who had been so sure of himself all his life, was reduced by love to the helpless uncertainty of any lover, unable to read the heart of the one whose heart he most longed to read, mistaking her guarded reserve, as she mistook his, for indifference. And so the two of them lived on in the same house, each loving the other with a whole heart, each suffering the slander's wound in solitude, each longing to speak, and each silenced by the same scrupulous honor and the same lover's fear, until the day Isobel, driven past bearing by her own version of the torment, came to her husband's study to set him free, and broke, all unknowing, the dam that had held back both their hearts. The campaign of slander mounted by the guardian and the magistrate was a study in the spite of small men, and its very malice was the measure of how completely the worth they had despised had escaped and exceeded them. They had been, the pair of them, supremely confident of their bargain, and the collapse of it had stung them in their tenderest part, which was their pride. Mr. Crouch had been certain his ultimatum would break his ward to his will, and instead had seen her walk out his door and, within weeks, rise to a height that made his own consequence look small. Mr. Birch had been certain the penniless nobody would jump at his condescending offer, and instead had been refused, and then had the mortification of seeing the woman who had refused him become a duchess. It was unbearable to them both, and the more unbearable because there was nothing they could lawfully do about it. The girl was beyond their reach, married, protected, exalted, and so, being the men they were, they did the only thing left to small, spiteful natures, balked of their will. They tried to poison what they could not touch, to spoil with whispers the triumph they could not prevent. The slander they spread was cunningly contrived to do the most damage at the least risk. They could not say the Duchess had done anything wrong, for she had not, so they twisted the very facts of her courage into a tale of calculation, recasting her brave flight as a designing stratagem, her rescue as an entrapment, her honorable marriage as a clever girl's capture of a duped great man. They told it in alehouses and drawing-rooms. They shook their heads over it with affected regret. They let it be understood that they, who knew the girl, could tell a different story from the romantic one going about. It was beneath contempt, and the Duke, when he learned of it, treated it so, but it did its work none the less upon the one heart most vulnerable to it, the heart of Isobel herself, who heard in it the echo of her own deepest fear. The small men could not reach her with the law or the world, but they reached her, for a cruel moment, through her own humility and her own secret dread, and that, for spiteful natures, was victory enough, until the Duke rose up to undo it. The conviction that drove Isobel toward renunciation, and made her very love ready to give him up, was not weakness, but the cruel logic of a humble and loving heart, and it shows how nearly two people may be parted by the very nobility of their natures. Consider how the slander worked upon her. She did not believe, of course, the base motive it imputed to her. She knew she had not schemed or entrapped, knew her flight had been pure desperate courage, and her marriage a shelter honorably offered and honorably taken. But the slander did not need her to believe its lie. It needed only to wake her own fear, and her own fear was already half awake. For beneath the slander's false charge lay a true question that Isobel could not answer to her own comfort. Had she not, however blamelessly, been the cause of her husband's marrying beneath him? Had he not bound himself, a great man, to a penniless nobody, out of honor and chivalry and not out of love? Was she not, whatever her innocence of design, a weight upon him? A marriage the world thought a folly, and that he himself, for all his courtesy, might in his heart regret? She had married him believing he could not love her. The slander now told her the world thought him entrapped, and between her own belief and the world's whisper there formed a single unbearable conclusion, that she had cost a good man dear and given him nothing but a burden in return. And her love, which should have bound her to him, became instead the engine that drove her to leave, for that is the cruel arithmetic of a loving and a humble heart. Because she loved him, she could not bear to be a burden to him. Because she wanted his good above her own, she would sooner break her own heart than be a weight upon his, because she believed he did not love her. She could see no reason he should wish to keep her, and every reason of his honor and his consequence why he might be glad, in his secret heart, to be free. So she reasoned herself, by way of her very love, to the conclusion that the noblest thing she could do was to offer him his liberty, to take herself out of a life she believed she only encumbered, to give back, as freely as she had once walked into the fog, the security and the position she had gained, sooner than hold a good man to a marriage she was sure did him harm. It was the same courage that had carried her out of her uncle's house, turned now to a sadder purpose, the same willingness to give up everything sooner than do a thing she thought dishonorable. She had refused once to be a burden bought, she would refuse now to be a burden kept. And it was only the breaking of the truth, in the very hour she came to renounce him, that saved two people from being parted forever by the nobility that should have joined them. She went to him to offer him his freedom, and it was in that conversation, meant to part them, that the truth at last broke free on both sides, and the two proud, honest people who had each been suffering in secret discovered, in a rush, how completely they had misunderstood each other. She came to him in his study one evening, pale and resolute, and said what she had steeled herself to say, that she had heard the slander, that she feared she had done him a great wrong in marrying him, had been the cause of his binding himself beneath his station to a penniless woman he did not love, that she would not hold him to a bargain that the world and perhaps his own heart must make him regret, that she released him so far as it lay in her power, and would retire quietly and trouble him no more, and leave him free. She got it out steadily, though it cost her everything, and she stood waiting, with her dignity wrapped about her like a cloak, for the relief she was sure her noble offer would bring him. She did not get relief. She got, instead, the sight of the most self-commanded man in England losing his self-command entirely. For the Duke, hearing her offer to leave him, felt the whole carefully maintained structure of his reserve collapse at a blow, and the love he had been hiding came pouring out past every barrier he had built against it. He told her, not coldly now, not carefully, but with a raw and unguarded passion she had never seen in him, that she had understood everything backward, that he did not regret his marriage, but blessed it as the one piece of good fortune in his cold life, that the slander was a lie he would crush, that the notion of her leaving him was not a relief, but a horror. The loss of the one thing that had ever made him truly alive. And then he told her the deepest truth of all, the thing he had hidden even from himself for so long, that he had told her once he had no heart to give, and that he had been wrong, wholly wrong, that he had a heart after all, that she had called it back to life out of the cold grave he had buried it in, and that it was hers, entirely and forever, whether she would have it or not. He loved her, he said, loved her as he had never believed himself capable of loving, had loved her, he thought, since the foggy road, and only his long folly of denying his own heart had kept him from knowing it. And Isobel, hearing the cold self-commanded Duke pour out a love she had been certain he could never feel, understood at last the full extent of their mutual blindness, and felt the long secret sorrow of her marriage break and dissolve in a joy almost too great to bear. But a private confession was not enough to undo a public slander, and so the Duke, with his wife now sure of his heart, set himself to crush the lie before the whole world, and to honor Isobel so openly and so completely that no tongue would ever dare to whisper against her again. He chose his ground deliberately, a great gathering of the county and beyond, the first grand entertainment of the season, at which all the world that had heard the slander would be assembled to watch how the Duke of Greywood carried his disputed marriage. They came expecting, the curious crowd, to see a duped husband and a shamed adventuress, to read in the Duke's cold reserve some sign that the whispers were true and the marriage a regret. They saw nothing of the kind. They saw the Duke of Greywood, that famously cold and self-commanded man, devote the entire evening to his wife in a display of open, deliberate, unmistakable adoration such as no one present had ever seen him show to any living soul, saw him keep her at his side, defer to her, watch her with a warmth that transformed his grave face, present her to the highest in the room with a pride there was no mistaking. And when the moment came, when some bold, malicious tongue, greatly daring, made before the company a veiled allusion to the manner of the marriage, to the foggy road and the fortunate flight, the Duke of Greywood answered it, clearly and coldly, so that the whole listening room could hear. He said that he had heard the lie that was being whispered, and would say, once and before them all, what the truth was, that on a certain foggy night he had found a girl turned out of doors for refusing to sell herself to a man she could not respect, and walking into the winter dark with nothing sooner than do a dishonorable thing, that he counted the meeting the greatest good fortune of his life, that he had married her not from chivalry, as the kind said, nor been entrapped by her, as the cruel said, but had won, by the luckiest chance that ever befell a cold and undeserving man, the bravest and the most honorable woman he had ever known, and that any person who breathed a word against the Duchess of Greywood breathed it, against the Duke, and might answer to him for it. It was said with the full cold weight of his rank and his certainty behind it, and it fell on that listening room like a thunderclap, and the slander died in the saying, killed stone dead by a husband's open devotion, never to be whispered again. And Isobel, standing at his side as he defended her before the world, felt the last shadow lift from her life and knew herself for the first time since her father died, wholly safe, wholly honored, and wholly loved. Seen from within Isobel's own heart, as she stood at her husband's side and heard him defend her before the world, the public reversal was the moment her whole long sentence of being unwanted was overturned. And she felt it as a kind of disbelieving wonder. She had come to the great gathering in a strange new peace, for the truth was out between them now, and she knew herself loved, but she had not known what her husband meant to do. And she stood at his side that evening still half-braced, by long habit, for the world's slight. She felt the curious eyes upon her, the eyes of all the people who had heard the whispers, felt herself, for a moment, the friendless dependent again, exposed to the careless judgment of her betters. And then she felt the whole current of the evening turn as her husband took his stand. She felt his devotion settle about her, open and unmistakable, felt him keep her at his side and present her with a pride that silenced the curious, And then she heard him answer the malicious tongue, heard the cold, deliberate weight of his words fall upon that listening room, heard him declare before all the world that she was the bravest and most honorable woman he had ever known, and that any word against her was a word against him. And standing there, hearing it, Isobel felt the last of the old wound, the long ache of being unwanted that had been with her since her father died, lift clean away. For all her life she had been the one overlooked, the dependent at the edge of the room, the girl reckoned at nothing, and now, before the whole assembled world, the man she loved was declaring her worth, staking his own great consequence on her honor, lifting her in a single public act from the dust her uncle had ground her into to the place of the most honored woman in the room. She had walked into a fog with nothing, sooner than be sold, and here she stood, in a blaze of candlelight, owned and defended and adored before them all. The very world that had whispered against her now compelled to see her as her husband saw her. She owned that room, though she had not said a word, owned it by the simple force of being, manifestly and undeniably, a woman a great man, loved and honored, and would defend to the last, and beneath the wonder of it, the disbelief that this should be happening to her. She felt rise a deep and quiet vindication, that her father's teaching had been true after all, that her worth had never been the world's to price, and that the courage which had cost her everything on a foggy night had bought her, in the end, a place no one could ever take from her again. There was a plain justice in the confounding of Mr. Crouch and Mr. Birch when the Duke's public defense reached them and the world turned against their slander, and it turned, fittingly, on the very worth they had been too small and too greedy ever to see. The two men had spread their poison confident of doing damage without consequence. They had reckoned, as mean men do, that a whisper costs nothing and cannot be traced. They had reckoned without the Duke of Greywood. When word came to them of how the Duke had answered the slander before the assembled county, how he had declared the truth of the foggy night in ringing terms, named the Duchess the bravest and most honorable of women, and promised, with the full cold weight of his rank, that any person who breathed a word against her should answer to him for it, the two slanderers found their comfortable malice turned suddenly very dangerous indeed. The county, which loves a duke and loves a romance and loves above all to be on the winning side, turned against them as one. The whisper they had set going was traced, as such things always are, back to its grasping source, and Mr. Crouch and Mr. Birch found themselves, instead of quietly spoiling another's happiness, publicly marked as the spiteful authors of a slander against a duchess whom a duke had sworn to defend. It was the ruin of their petty consequence in the only world they had. Mr. Birch, the magistrate who had thought to acquire a cheap young wife and been refused, found himself an object of general derision. The cold old man who had been turned down by a penniless girl who went on to be a duchess, and whose spite at the refusal was now exposed for all to mock, his stony dignity, the only thing he had, lay in ruins, and he retired into a sour and diminished obscurity. Mr. Crouch fared no better. The grasping uncle who had tried to sell his niece and cast her into the dark, and then slandered her when she rose, was held in open contempt by the neighborhood, shunned by the respectable, and left to chew the bitter knowledge that the ward he had reckoned at nothing and tried to dispose of for his own profit had risen, by her own worth, to a height from which she need never think of him again. Neither man was punished by any law. Their offense was beneath the law's notice, but both were confounded, exposed, and diminished, left to the cold company of their own meanness, while the woman they had wronged shone far above them in a happiness they had done everything to prevent. It was the justest of endings for such men, not a dramatic downfall, but the plain, quiet spectacle of their own smallness, and the worth they had despised exalted forever beyond their reach. And so Isobel, who had walked into the fog with nothing rather than be sold, found that the courage which had cost her everything had bought her, in the end, the only things worth having, her own honor kept, her own worth proved, and a love freely given and freely returned, chosen at last by a heart that was wholly her own. For she had not come to her happiness as a rescued dependent grateful to be kept, nor as a friendless girl who had no choice but to take what shelter offered. She had come to it by the hard road of her own courage and her own integrity, having refused to be sold, having chosen the cold dark over the comfortable cage, having staked everything she had on her own worth and her refusal to betray it. And the love she now gave her husband she gave freely, as an equal and not a dependent, from the strength of a woman who had proved, on a foggy road, that she could not be bought at any price, gave it gladly, knowing it returned to the man who had taught her, who had thought himself heartless, that she was beyond all price, and worth the whole waking of a heart he had buried for a lifetime. She had once told him she would feign no love she did not feel, and now she told him, plainly and joyfully, in the language of two honest people who had finished at last with pretending, that the love she had hidden so long was his, had been his this long while, and would be his as long as she lived. A word should be said, too, of how the neighborhood came round in the end, for the same county that had drunk in the slander learned, in time, to love the Duchess of Greywood, and the manner of its conversion is itself a small lesson in worth. It did not happen all at once. The world is slow to admit it has misjudged, and faster to whisper than to make amends. But worth, given time, has a way of telling, and Isobel's worth told, as it had always told, upon everyone who came near enough to see it truly. The county families who had half believed the slander found when they met the Duchess. A woman so plainly good and so quietly dignified that the whispers withered of their own accord in the face of her. The poor of the Greywood estate, who cared nothing for slander and everything for kindness, loved her from the first, and their love, which is the truest testimonial a great lady can have, did more to establish her than all the drawing-rooms in the county. And the Duke's open and unwavering devotion, which never for a moment faltered or apologized, taught even the slowest that whatever they had heard, the man who knew her best held her beyond all price. So the tide turned, as tides do, and turned for good. Within a year or two, the very people who had repeated the slander were boasting of their acquaintance with the Duchess. The romantic truth of the foggy night, which was a far better story than the slander, and had besides the advantage of being true, became the favorite tale of the county, and Isobel, who had come among them a fugitive under a cloud of whispers, was established, by the simple slow force of her own quality and her husband's love, as the most respected and best-loved lady for 30 miles around. And if there was a lesson in it, beyond the pleasure of seeing merit rewarded, it was this, that slander is loud but worth is patient, and that a good name unjustly lost may be unjustly hard to regain, but is regained, in the end, by no clever defense half so surely as by the long, quiet evidence of simply being, day after day, the good thing one was slandered for not being. Isobel never troubled to answer her slanderers. She merely went on being herself, and being herself in the end was answer enough. The first days of their true and confessed marriage, after the dam had broken and the long misunderstanding been swept away, were the spring that followed a hard winter for them both, and the sweeter for the secret sorrow each had borne. It was a strange and a wonderful thing, after weeks of guarded silence, to be free at last to love each other openly. The Duke, who had buried his heart for 20 years and then hidden it for weeks more, found himself a lover at 37 with all a young man's wonder, discovered with a kind of astonished joy the pleasures of a love confessed and returned, the freedom to show the tenderness he had so long suppressed, the simple happiness of being able to tell his wife what she was to him and to see the answering love in her face. And Isobel, released from the long secret anguish of loving where she believed she could not be loved, blossomed under the open warmth of her husband's regard like a plant brought out of shadow into the sun, found the careful guard she had kept over her own heart no longer needed, and let her love show at last, freely and gladly, to the man she had so long adored in silence. And there was a particular sweetness in their happiness that came from the way it had been won, for they had each suffered, in secret and alone, the conviction that their love was not returned, had each been ready to give the other up sooner than be a burden, had come within a single conversation of parting forever out of the very nobility of their natures. And having so nearly lost each other, they prized what they had found the more. They did not take their love for granted, as those who come to it easily so often do. They remembered, each of them, the long weeks of secret sorrow, and marveled the more at the joy that had followed, the cold, honorable bargain they had struck, the marriage without love that each had braced to endure, had blossomed into the very thing each had warned the other not to hope for, a great and a tender and a holy mutual love. And the great house of Greywood, which had been for so long the cold domain of a self-commanded and a solitary man, became, under the warmth of that confessed love, as happy a home as any in England. He had thought, marrying her, that he had no heart to give. He had given it entire, and got, in return, a love that made the cold proud years before her seem to him, looking back like a long sleep from which a friendless girl in a fog had at last awakened him. The old godmother, Lady Marbury, took a deep private joy in seeing the marriage she had watched over come to its happy harbor. She had been the one who saw the truth from the first. And her satisfaction in the end was that of a wise old woman vindicated. She had seen it all along. The shrewd old countess had watched the two proud, honest creatures fall deeper in love by the week, and each refuse, out of pride and scruple, to admit it, had been hard put to it, on her visits, not to take them both by the ear and tell them what any fool could see. She had held her tongue, for she knew that some things must ripen in their own time, and that a love each was determined to deny would only dig itself in deeper if pushed. But she had watched, and waited, and hoped, with the particular interest of a woman who loved her goddaughter dearly, and had taken, besides, a great liking to the grave duke who had rescued her. And when the long comedy of mutual blindness came at last to its happy ending, when the truth broke and the two of them came to her, no longer guarded but openly and joyfully in love, Lady Marbury's satisfaction was complete. She did not, being herself, let them off without a little wholesome mockery. She told them, in her tart, affectionate way, exactly how absurd the pair of them had been. The two cleverest people of her acquaintance, each breaking a perfectly good heart in secret while the other did the very same in the next room, and each too proud and too punctilious to say the one word that would have ended it months sooner, declared that she had never in her long life seen two people work so hard to be miserable about a thing that ought to have made them happy from the first, and pronounced, with the air of an oracle vindicated, that she had known how it would end before either of them had the sense to. But beneath the tartness her joy was deep and real. She had loved Isobel's mother, and grieved over the lost orphan for years, and to see that orphan now not merely safe, but cherished, raised to a great position, and far better, to a great love, was the dearest happiness of the old woman's age. She had been, in a sense, the instrument of it, having sheltered the girl and championed her, and lent her the consequence that helped to right her, and she took, in the happy ending, the particular satisfaction of one who has helped to bring a good thing about and lived to see it flourish. The mother she had loved was gone, but the mother's daughter was happy, and loved and safe, and Lady Marbury, watching the pair of them, felt that an old debt of love to a dead friend had been at the last most sweetly paid. There was a particular evening, long after, that the Duke kept in his heart as the truest emblem of all that had befallen them, and it is worth the telling, for it gathers up the whole meaning of the tale into a single quiet moment by a fire. It was a foggy November night, the anniversary, though neither had spoken of it, of the night she had walked out of her uncle's house into the dark, and the two of them were sitting late together by the fire in the great warm library of Greywood, the children long abed, the cold white fog pressing soft against the black windows, the room within all amber light and warmth. The Duke had risen to look out at the fog, and Isobel had come to stand beside him, and the two of them had looked out together at the same cold dark that had once held nothing for either of them but ruin. And the Duke had said, quietly, that he had been thinking of another foggy night, and Isobel had slipped her hand into his and said that she had been thinking of it too. They did not say much more. They had long since passed the need of many words. But the Duke, looking out at the fog with his wife's hand in his and the warm firelit room at his back, felt the whole strange providence of their lives gathered into that one moment, and was moved as he was seldom moved. Out there, on just such a night, a friendless girl had walked into the cold dark sooner than betray herself, and a cold-buried man had waited in it without knowing what he waited for, and the two of them had found each other in the fog, and been each the saving of the other, and walked together out of the cold dark into all this warmth and light and love. The fog that had once meant ruin meant nothing to them now, but the memory of how their happiness had begun, the cold dark they had each braved alone, had become the threshold of the one true home of both their lives. He turned from the window and drew his wife back to the fire, and the two of them sat down again together in the amber warmth, the fog shut safely out beyond the glass. Two souls who had each walked alone into the cold dark and come out of it, together into the light. It was the truest emblem of their whole story that the darkest road, taken in honor and walked through to its end, had led them, by ways neither could have foreseen, straight home to the fire and to each other. So bank your fire now, and turn your lamp low, and let the dark draw gentle and close. A grasping man said to a friendless girl, "Wed the magistrate or get out," and she got out, and walked into a freezing fog sooner than sell herself, and found waiting in it a man who had buried his own heart, and who learned, because she was brave enough to choose the dark, that he had a heart after all, and that it was hers. They lived long and happily, the Duke and his Duchess, in a marriage that was everything their cold, honest bargain had warned them not to hope for, and the grasping guardian and the hard magistrate, who had reckoned her at nothing and tried to sell her cheap, lived to see the ward they had despised become the most honored lady in the county, and could not undo it. Somewhere tonight, by some fire I shall never see, you have sat with a girl who chose the cold dark over a comfortable cage, and the man who was waiting in the fog, and I am glad of it, more glad than I can say, and I should dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from. Remember, when next the world tries to tell you that you must take the safe and the bearable thing, because you have no choice and no worth to bargain with, that there is a courage that chooses the fog over the cage, that your worth is never the world's to price, and that the dark road taken in honor has been known, more often than the careful would believe, to have someone waiting at the end of it. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit.